Okay, good evening, everyone. Thanks so much for coming out this evening. It's a real pleasure to be able to spend a little bit of time with all of you. We're joined tonight by Dr. Will Kurtz from the University of Virginia, and he's the one that assisted me. We were kind of tried to divide up the work even Steven, with this particular book project. So we'll be hearing from him in a little bit this evening after I've completed my part. I'm going to be talking about the Civil War chaplains, and Dr. Kurtz is going to be talking about the Civil War sister nurses. You know, it's somewhat cliche to call tonight's lecture the untold story of sacrifice and heroism of Catholic priests, chaplains, and sister nurses. But in many ways, this is true, and this was certainly what David Power Cunningham, who authored the book Soldiers of the Cross, had in mind. There were about 750 Catholic priests and religious who were directly involved in the U.S. Civil War, and many of their stories have still not been told, whether because of their own sense of modesty and not wanting to promote themselves, or the fact that there's been quite a bit of scholarly neglect related to religion and the U.S. Civil War. A little bit more about that later. Yet there have been some attempts to correct this. It is a task that is incomplete, but is continuing thanks to the work of many scholars and historians. So our contribution to this effort is the recently published book that some of you have tonight, Soldiers of the Cross, which Dr. Kurtz and I transcribed, edited, and annotated. It was released over the summer by the University of Notre Dame Press. And so we're certainly grateful for those of you that are interested in procuring a copy tonight, or, of course, through Amazon or another online retailer. So what about this particular project? You might be thinking, well, I thought you authored a book. Well, kind of. Soldiers of the Cross is a manuscript that has been unpublished for more than 100 years. And it's the history of Catholic chaplains and sister nurses. It's been housed at the University of Notre Dame archives for many decades. And its author, who is pictured here above, David Power Cunningham, is an Irish-American journalist and war veteran who compiled this work shortly after the war ended, beginning in the late 1860s. Though he was a prolific writer, and he was very successful in publishing a number of texts related to Irish history and Irish spirituality and the war itself, including a history of the Irish Brigade, he still had not finished Soldiers of the Cross at the time of his own death in 1883. And so it kind of relied to a future person or persons to finally bring it to print. Now, from time to time over these decades, this particular manuscript was inspected at the archives, it was cited in a few scholarly studies, but for the most part it remained just as it was, pretty much a stack of manuscript pages, an unpublished 19th century testimonial to Catholics in the war. Now that changed, of course, when a number of years ago, actually about 6 or 7 years ago, Dr. Kurtz and I ran into one another at a conference, and we kind of independently had the same thought, which is that this great work, this unpublished work, should find its way before people. It should be available to historians and scholars and the general public. And so, as you might imagine, the state of this manuscript really was not pristine. There's actually the very first page of this is replicated for you on the PowerPoint. Do you see some frayed edges? Yes, there were some frayed edges. There were some illegible words, and words that, because of their origination in the 19th century, didn't exactly match our own modern vocabulary. And so at times there was discussions between us and other scholars even at times about what these words really were. What was the author's intention on a particular page? And so during the author's own lifetime, there were also a couple different hands who tried to make some edits to this. You can actually see this at the very top of the page. There's another hand that's kind of written a little note there. And so most of what is contained in this volume then is really not our own words. It is David Power Cunningham's words. But we as scholars and editors have attempted to faithfully represent his work with as little intervention as possible, except for the inclusion of some introductions, some epilogues, some source paragraphs, and then some very significant, in terms of number, footnotes, which attempt to identify many of the people who are contained in this narrative. And so you might ask yourself, well, why is this particular work, which has now been published, gone from unpublished to published, why is this important? Why should people concern themselves with this? And I think part of the answer lies in the state of Civil War scholarship, especially related to chaplains' contributions and chaplains' life. And as I mentioned earlier, that's my part tonight, is to talk a little bit about the chaplains, followed by Dr. Kurtz talking about the sisters. So you see these chaplains who were very involved in the war effort, literally with the troops, on the battlefield, in the camp. And you do have, luckily, some pictures that do show some of their life. And so here we have probably the most famous picture, Father Thomas Mooney, who is preparing, it seems, to celebrate Mass with the troops in a kind of tent chapel. And then we have Father Cooney from the University of Notre Dame, one of the better known of the Union chaplains, also pictured here tonight. Now you might think, well, these priest chaplains, they should be well known. There weren't that many of them. In fact, there were really only about 80 total, 50 Union and 30 or so Confederate. And some served for a year or two, some for 3. But perhaps there were no more than 24 Union chaplains serving at any one time. Other chaplains, though, stationed near places of battle, were also called upon or offered themselves to fulfill some of these roles. Now, they were fulfilling the spiritual needs of about 200,000 Catholic Union soldiers and maybe 20 or 30,000 Catholic Confederate soldiers. Now, these chaplains were often called by the soldiers Holy Joes, a kind of nickname or shorthand for the presence of the priest chaplain. Now, this role of the chaplains has often been overlooked by historians. We know, for instance, that very few of the published works that deal with chaplains actually mention the priests at all, instead favoring a kind of generic Protestant Christianity that overlooks Catholics completely. And even though there are some works which do mention chaplains, in many cases, it's only scant reference, not very significant, at least in terms of the amount of pages or the references that are used in these histories. And so I think that now more than ever, it's important for us to look at what is the legacy, what is the importance of these priest chaplains? What was their work like? What did they do? When we look at this particular question of the priest chaplains and their role, we can think about the fact that these chaplains would have been ministering to the soldiers in the most difficult of circumstances, even in time of great danger to their own lives. And so there are many reports of priest chaplains kind of going into the thick of battle in order to hear confession, literally in the saddle, as it was said, or to provide the last rites of the church to those who had been mortally wounded. But their role was equally important outside of battle. Chaplains served to keep morale up, and cautioned against various kinds of immorality, like excessive gambling or drinking. Certainly, priest chaplains broke up more than a few card games and convinced soldiers to take the pledge to avoid alcohol during the time that they were serving in the military. But chaplains also did things that were even more mundane, like writing letters for soldiers to send back to their families, or making sure that soldiers' pay made it back to those who needed it most, wives and children. It is said that some chaplains transported huge sums of money, maybe tens of thousands of dollars, on their person at one time. And so you have some amazing stories of certainly heroism on the battlefield, but a kind of everyday heroism as well that was important to those that they were serving. So what do we find within this book, Soldiers of the Cross? Well, we find that about 2/3 of the work deals with the chaplains, and he focuses on 12 Union and 3 Confederate. Now, the choice of these chaplains is not altogether clear, except that the information was available to him on select chaplains based on his correspondence with the priests themselves, or sometimes with their religious superiors or their bishops. Now, Cunningham, when he is presenting the role of the chaplains, does it in a kind of idealized kind of way, likely because the war was so recent. Remember, he's writing this in the 1860s and 70s. Healing was very much needed. And so, as the subtitle of his work suggests, he was drawn to depict heroism wherever it could be found, whether North or South, Union or Confederate. And so here are a few examples tonight of this kind of heroism, the kinds of examples that he is portraying. The first is in the form of the story of Father Thomas Scully. You see a picture of him here tonight. Also a picture of him ready to celebrate Mass, and then a more formal picture of him. He was chaplain to the 9th Massachusetts, and he's one of those chaplains who, yes, surprised a group of soldiers in the middle of their card game. He saw this kind of through a slit in the tent. He ran in, grabbed the money that had been put down as wager, and then said, "Don't worry, boys, this is going to charity." More about Father Scully in a moment. Another great example of moral guidance, a great example of someone that was trying to bring about conversion and repentance, is a Dominican priest by the name of Father Constantine Egan. Now, Father Egan had the very difficult situation of trying to console a number of deserters who were destined to die. And he exhorted them in the moments before their deaths to go about, quote, the work of their salvation. He said, "You have no hope in this life. Set your sights, set your life on what is to come. Make peace with your God." Cunningham writes, "The poor fellows complied with his exhortation. They made their confessions, and they went to Holy Communion on the morning of the day of their execution, in the same tent where Father Egan celebrated Mass for them." End of quote. And so you have these amazing moments when the ministry of the chaplain, the ministry of the priest, makes all the difference, spiritually, morally, in terms of salvation. We also see many examples in Cunningham's book about the confessions that were heard. Yes, sometimes in battle, other times wounded soldiers, bed-stricken soldiers in hospitals. There's the story of Father Carrier, Joseph Carrier, a Holy Cross priest, who it is said went to one of the hospitals and found a large number of men who had not been to confession for many, many years. It is said, according to his diary, that for some it had been 10 years, others 20 years, one 48 years. And it is said, according to what he recorded, that all of the Catholics went to confession that day except for two. Quote, "It was one of the greatest, if not absolutely the greatest harvest of that priest's life." So to think about the difference that the presence of these priest chaplains made. But this doesn't mean that it was always easy for them either. They endured many of the same privations as those they were serving. We come to the example of Father Gillen, also a Holy Cross priest who was chaplain to the 170th New York. While he was about his duty, he found an abandoned brick church, and he made it basically his place of headquarters. And he started hearing confessions for the men in the early afternoon, and then into the late afternoon and even into the evening. And as he was kept continuously busy, a tremendous storm developed, and it is said he was obliged to remain in that church alone all night, even after all of the penitents had gone. Quote, "Having nothing but his boots for a pillow, and the floor of the church for his bed, and the roof his only covering, he spent the night there." And lastly, in terms of some of these particular examples, we return to our friend Father Thomas Scully, the one who broke up the card game. There's also a great story, and this is kind of a leitmotif to the whole work, is about, I'll just say, the superiority of the vocation of the priest compared to some of the non-Catholic ministers who served. Apparently, Father Scully was at a meeting of mostly Protestant Civil War chaplains. This is during the war. And the discussion turned to the fact that all of the Protestant chaplains wanted a raise. And some of them said, "Let's go on strike until we're paid what we deserve." And this is what Father Scully said to those assembled. "Gentlemen, I cannot join you in your movement, for our country has enemies on the outside. I am sorry to learn this day that she also has foes within. For I, as a priest, have a higher rank than the President or the Congress. I labor in the service of God, and He is the one who is my paymaster. My soldiers will support me. I need not trouble the government of this nation, to do which my church commands me to do, without money and without price." Do you think any of the Protestant ministers made any more of a deal about their pay? Of course, they did not. And so we come to this question then, of the significance of all of this. And I think as we consider the role of the chaplains, we recognize the fact that they were very much lauded for their wartime service at the time, even if subsequent generations have not always known all of their stories. Here's actually a picture of those from the University of Notre Dame who were involved in the movement, essentially, the GAR, responsible for the memory of the war, the service of the war. And so you see all of these Holy Cross priest chaplains there with their service medals, their service pins. One of the famous post-war photos that show the appreciation that was had for these priest chaplains. One of the testimonials that is contained in Cunningham's work involves appreciation for these chaplains. And the very first part of this work is all appreciations. So you have letters from leading figures like Robert E. Lee, believe it or not, George McClellan, and then this one from General Joseph Hooker. In camp, by pious example and religious teaching, the priest softened and Christianized the tone and actions of the men. While in the field, he was always found with them, regardless of danger. And where his duty called him, and where the wounded or dying needed his ministrations, he could always be found. This, I think, is the legacy, or should be the legacy, of these heroic men. One of the men who has been honored, certainly in a very official way, is that of Father William Corby, who is pictured here, also a Holy Cross priest and two-time president of the University of Notre Dame. He was one of the chaplains assigned to the Irish Brigade. And he was the only chaplain, priest chaplain, who was present at Gettysburg. And he famously gave the pre-battle absolution. So there's this story of him basically mounting this large rock and providing this benediction and absolution. This exact scene is memorialized through a bronze statue that exists at Gettysburg, and then a replica on the campus of the University of Notre Dame. It's also the particular image that is contained on the front of Soldiers of the Cross. So you see him there on top of the rock with arms outstretched in blessing. So in conclusion, our Catholic priest chaplains were heroic in their service, and even though their role has been sometimes neglected by scholars and even results in some questions about their service, there are many untold stories, many edifying stories contained here within Soldiers of the Cross. So we thank you for being here tonight to hear just a snippet of them and for being part of this effort to reclaim the history of those that have gone before us. Thank you.
Hello? Can everybody hear me or no? 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 Okay. Yeah, I can do that. You can help me out a little bit here.
Sure. Basically, just pin this to your jacket, I would say. And then I do think you need to just touch the switch there.
Okay.
See if that works for you.
Sorry. Okay, is that better? No? Well, I'm going to have to yell. Okay. As I can, so everybody can hear me. Apologize for technical difficulties here. But thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's great to have such a wonderful turnout, and I'm going to talk today about the nuns at the battlefield. So the last third of the book by David Power Cunningham. And this book, this part of the book is, even though it's not as large as the priest chaplain part, it is still just as important. This story is just as important to David Power Cunningham and should be to us as the story of the Catholic priests during the Civil War. So, like I said, thank you everyone for being here. A brief note about me. I come to you via the University of Virginia, where I work as the managing director of the John L. Now III Civil War History Center. And before that, I was at the University of Notre Dame, and I had the good fortune to have a wonderful advisor there who told me to go to UVA and work with the best Civil War scholar in the country, Gary Gallagher, who retired just a couple years ago. That's all I'm going to say about myself, other than to say this is not the first book I've worked on Catholics in the Civil War. My first book, which also has the Corby image on it, because let's face it, there's only one good, really great, heroic image of Catholics in the Civil War, is that painting at Notre Dame, actually. Everything comes back to Notre Dame. I apologize. It's just the way it is. It all comes back. It all comes back to that story. So let me move in out of Corby and out of Notre Dame for a little bit. and talk about the Catholic sisters in the Civil War, nuns of the battlefield as they were called. So if you look at this image here, this image comes to us via an illustrated weekly newspaper called Harper's Weekly. It was the most important illustrated newspaper published in the North in the 19th century, and it was Republican, and it was not known for being favorable to Catholics. In fact, after the war, it would become the exact opposite. And you can see, thanks whoever got that working, you can see that in the image, 1/3 of the image is the Sister of Charity. And the Sister of Charity is there working to take care of a sick man in a hospital. She is 1/3 of this image that depicts the way that Northern women supported the Union war effort. And the fact that a newspaper like Harper's Weekly, as important as it was, and not democratic and not pro-Catholic, would recognize that these sisters played this huge role on behalf of the war effort really speaks to how they were appreciated at the time. And why not, after all? There were 600 to 700 sisters who served in the Civil War on both sides of the conflict. They were the only significant group of women with any medical training, any nursing training at the time that the Civil War started. They were really phenomenal. I'll go all over this in a little bit more detail in just a second as we get further into the talk. But even as they were recognized at the time as being very important to the Union and Confederate war efforts in terms of their nursing in hospitals, Civil War scholarship has pretty much completely neglected them. Catholic scholarship loves them, as you'd imagine. Get into that in just a second. But Civil War scholarship, they're just completely invisible. I won't bore you with all the reasons for that, but I'll just give you some examples. If you read what is the best single volume about the Civil War, which is James McPherson's famous Battle Cry of Freedom, published back in 1988, still the best book on the Civil War, single book on the war, you would have no idea that there were Catholics who served as nurses during the Civil War. You know about women serving, but you had no idea that there were Catholics, lay or religious at all. Women in the Civil War, one of the two books depicted here, was a monumental study of what women did during the Civil War. The only time a sister or a nun shows up in the entire book is when one of the Protestant nurses, female nurses, is complaining about them, complaining about what they were doing. And I don't mean to rag too much on the Protestant community of that time, but that is the only time that historian cared enough to say anything about them. They're not in the index or whatever. A half a dozen of the most important books about women in the Civil War since this book don't mention them even a single time. Don't even get the Protestant ladies hate them bit in there. There's only one book that it's a collection of essays, and in that collection of essays, they included one chapter about Catholic sisters, which I guess is an improvement, right? But if most Civil War scholars and scholars of women's history have ignored these remarkable women, Catholic historians have actually perhaps overstudied this aspect of the Civil War. And by that, I mean we know more about the Catholic sisters in the Civil War just in the sheer number of articles and books, like the most famous one, To Bind Up the Wounds by Sister Mary Dennis Marr, than we do about pretty much any other aspect of the Catholic experience. There's just been a proliferation of interest by the communities themselves and by historians, especially historians, Catholic historians of the medical history of the United States. They're very prominent in their work. So you kind of have that kind of interesting, you have that interesting sort of dichotomy between total neglect and almost oversaturation. Sister Mary Dennis Marr, that's the most important book. But right here in Cincinnati, Sister Judith Metz wrote a very short little book, and I can cite it for you. It's the Sisters of Charity in Cincinnati during the Civil War. The Love of Christ Urges Us On. A really wonderful book with some actual letters from the Civil War that I encourage you to check out. The complete opposite of that book is a phone book kind of publication by Sister Betty Ann McNeil, a good friend of mine from the Daughters of Charity at Emmitsburg, Maryland. And that book is full of first-person accounts, or accounts written very shortly after the war about what the sisters did during the conflict. So there's a number of good books out there if you're interested in this topic. Oh, I'm sorry. So let's back up a second. So are nuns appreciated for all the things that they do in antebellum American society? Well, within Catholic society, of course, nuns and sisters are absolutely essential to the life of the antebellum Catholic Church. They come over in large numbers from their European mother houses. They create their own orders or own branches of the Sisters of Charity, as Elizabeth Ann Seton did in Emmitsburg in the early part of the 19th century. It's a huge proliferation of female religious doing work from education to caring for orphanages to, yes, even nursing as well. But the popular perception of nuns in a aggressively Protestant, evangelical, modern society, democratic society, is to see them as quintessential of everything that is backwards with Catholic culture, Catholic doctrine, Catholic, just everything about Catholics. You look at nuns and they are target number one after, I guess, only the Pope, really, in terms of who you hate. And the most important example of this, where it actually broke out into violence, was the Ursuline Convent, which was burned down by a riotous mob. The Ursuline Convent in Charleston was located just outside of Boston. It was very popular with Protestant and Catholic parents who could afford to send their daughters there, but a rumor led to the destruction of that property, which was never compensated by the state of Massachusetts. Right next to that, in the very next year, a woman who had been briefly in a convent as sort of a boarder, who claimed to have been a former nun who escaped a life of debauchery and sin and depravity in a convent in Canada, wrote a wholly fictional work called Maria. The shorthand is Maria Monk. Her name was Maria Monk, and she wrote about this experience. It was taken as gospel and as indicative of what life was really like behind the walls of a convent. So there's this huge backlash against the church, of course, as it grows and becomes more powerful in American society in the run-up to the Civil War. And there's a huge backlash against the nuns, which I really think makes the fact that they go out, many of them in ways that their community normally didn't do before the antebellum period, and served their fellow man, trying to be Christ to both Confederate and Federal. They were much more numerous than the priests. As Father David said, there were only about 80 priests, but there were 600 to 700 nuns who served. If you're a Catholic or a Protestant, you're anybody, Catholic, Protestant, whatever, black or white, you're much more likely to run into a sister nursing in one of the hospitals or serving at a triage site at a recent battlefield than you are to run into a Catholic priest. So they're the people who are the institutional church as far as most Protestants are concerned, and what the institutional church is doing during the Civil War. And the fact that they were so prominent is testified by a letter that the Surgeon General of the Union Army wrote to President Abraham Lincoln in July of 1862, so the war is only a year old at this point. Quote, "We have found in the Sisters of Charity a corps of faithful, devoted, and trained nurses ready to administer to the sick and wounded. No such organization exists among the Protestants of this country, and those whom we have employed cannot compare in efficiency and faithfulness with the Sisters of Charity. The latter are trained to obedience and are of irreproachable moral character, and most valuable are their ministrations. I am a Protestant myself, and therefore cannot be accused of partiality." This is the closest you get to a smoking gun letter in history, believe me. It's really fantastic, and that is Surgeon General William Hammond right there as well. The Sisters of Charity was a catch-all phrase for nuns at the time. Protestants didn't understand the differences between the different orders or communities. In fact, about 20 different groups of sisters or nuns served as nurses during the Civil War in some capacity. The largest of which is depicted right here in this picture here outside of Satterlee Hospital, which was a major hub for the Union hospital system. These are the famous Daughters of Charity of Emmitsburg. They were by far the largest group, perhaps 200 to 300 just from that one community. What did they do? Well, they did everything that nurses do today. They did everything from, they took care of the wounded, they changed bandages, they distributed rations. If a soldier was too sick or was illiterate, too sick to write or illiterate, they would write letters to the family. They cleaned, they endured horrible hardships, just like anyone else in the pre-hygiene era, which was a Civil War hospital. The work was very dirty in many cases, and a number of them died during the Civil War. I'll talk about a couple sisters in just a second here. And they faced discrimination on two fronts. First of all, nursing was traditionally a male occupation. It's something you gave to a slightly better off soldier who wasn't ready to go back to the front, but who could help around a hospital. So male surgeons had a prejudice against women. They didn't like, this is the Victorian era, they didn't like women being in such close contact with men and their various stages of wounds, undress, etc. And then you had the other front of that, which was from Protestant women, and the most famous example being the great reformer, Dorothea Dix, who became basically the head of the female nursing corps of the Union during the Civil War, and she absolutely despised the fact that the nuns were so prominent. And in fact, as you read in our book, one of the communities, I believe it's the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, actually threatened to leave should they be placed under her control. She was unable to appreciate that they were all trying to serve the sick, apparently. Anyway, how do the sisters fare in Soldiers of the Cross? Well, there are only 9 chapters, so about a third of the work. And there's only, a half dozen different communities that are represented, not by any means the whole. And for Cunningham, this is really the icing on the cake, if you will. This is the argument that shows that Catholics are good Americans just like everyone else, because the sisters went out, and despite all the things that they had faced before the Civil War, they were heroic and brave and did their best to take care of everyone in a time of great need, in which 620,000 people at least lost their lives and many more were wounded or went through a hospital system for disease and other things. So this is what he says, quote, "When the Protestant soldier found that the sister did as much to cool his aching wounds and to refresh him by delicacies and luxuries as she did for the Catholic patient who occupied the adjoining bed, he began to think that all his bigotry and prejudices were simply the result of his unchristian education, and that it was possible for one to be a Catholic and even a sister and to still possess all the noble attributes of true Christianity." He continues, "Their good works have proclaimed the success of their mission, and thousands today, even of different denominations, bless the name and memory of the good and pious and faithful sisters." Unfortunately, not enough to turn the tide against anti-Catholicism in American society, but still an important contribution to making people rethink the way they saw sisters and the larger church. Cunningham's great regret with this work, and perhaps why there aren't more chapters devoted to these remarkable women, is that so many of the communities declined. They didn't want to brag about what they had done. They didn't want to bring attention to themselves. After all, this work was about service to your fellow man and bringing people to Christ through this service. So let me give you just 2 examples tonight. One northern community and one southern community. And of course, you would think I would do the Sisters of Cincinnati, but I'm going to go back to my Notre Dame roots. We can talk about the sisters. Sister Anthony O'Connell is just fantastic. And stop. I don't know if I need to say anything else, but she and her sisters were about 40 to 50 of them were active all around this area, this Ohio Valley area, supporting Grant's army at Shiloh, supporting Rosecrans's army during 1863 while he was in command of the Army of the Cumberland. When Archbishop John Purcell, or Purcell as some people say it, supposedly that's the way he said it, according to a letter from his auxiliary, Bishop Rosecrans, told told General Rosecrans, brother of the bishop, that he couldn't send any more priests. He would send about a dozen Sisters of Charity. So they went wherever they were called. Okay, now back to the self-congratulatory Notre Dame portion of all this. At the time of the Civil War, the Sisters of the Holy Cross were still attached to the male community, the men of the Holy Cross. They hadn't split at this time. The undisputed leader of the sisters was actually one of the few Catholics prominent in the Civil War who wasn't Irish-born, but definitely of Irish descent. Angela Gillespie, who was Mother Angela, as known to the sisters, and she was the absolute leader of St. Mary's College at that time. And even though they had no training in nursing, they volunteered, and 63 of these sisters went to serve in places like Kentucky, Illinois, Tennessee, even all the way in Washington, D.C. After the Daughters of Charity, this is the second most important community of female religious in the Civil War. Governor Oliver Morton of Indiana sent for them personally in October 1861, and they answered the call in a big way. Two of these remarkable women actually died as a result of their service. They were exposed to the same diseases as the men were in those hospitals, right? They contracted diseases as a result of the poor conditions, despite their best efforts, of a hospital at Mound City, Illinois. It was basically, like many hospitals, a converted building that happened to be free, so it was a converted warehouse right along the Mississippi, which was prone to flooding. And the disease that came about because of this flooding and all the sick men there ultimately did these two sisters in. In fact, actually, a Notre Dame priest also died at Mound City as a result as well, so not a good place to be. Speaking of Mound City, one of the most important stories that the sisters tell about themselves relates to that hospital. I'll get to it in just a second. In June of 1862, the Battle of St. Charles was fought on the Mississippi River. It involved a combined Union amphibious and naval assault on a Confederate fort. And one of the Union commanders at that battle was a man named Augustus Kilty, U.S. Captain Augustus Kilty, and his Confederate foe was a man named Joseph Fry. And during the battle, when it seemed like it was over and there was no point to further resistance, what happened was a Confederate shell pierced the boiler on this ship, on the Kilty ship, and it's badly scalding all of the men on the ship, who fled into the Mississippi to get away, to relieve themselves of basically being boiled to death. Supposedly, Confederates fired on the men as they jumped into the river. So at this point, the wounded, shortly after the battle, the wounded Union soldiers are packed into the same Mound City Hospital as the wounded Confederate soldiers from that fort, including Colonel Joseph Fry, who everybody blames for the near mortal wounding of Kilty. And so they want to murder Kilty. They want to murder Fry for what they had done to his comrade. They said, as soon as he dies, we're going to kill Fry. And so the sister said, if you do this, we will leave. And the surgeon basically says, I can't do anything, you're on your own. So they take the keys and literally use their bodies as human shields to prevent the murder of this Confederate officer. And Kilty survives, and fortunately, as a result, the tensions die down. But it's a real remarkable story to show how the sisters served both sides, how their service put them in harm's way and really defied all of those negative stereotypes of sisters from before the war. One other remarkable aspect of their service is that they were among the first naval nurses, female naval nurses in U.S. history. That ship right there is the Red Rover. And unfortunately, our version of this text does not talk about the Red Rover. Okay, fine, I'm here, I might as well finish. There are two different versions of the Sisters of the Holy Cross narrative that Father David and I inherited. One of them is 3 chapters long and talks about this and some other wonderful stories, and the other one is 2 chapters long. Unfortunately, it's very clear that Cunningham only wanted the shorter version in, so we lose some of these stories, unfortunately, but that's part of the problem you have with a text like this that is in such a state of flux. You have to kind of make these difficult decisions. We can talk about places where you can find some more of those stories if you're interested. The other order I want to talk about, the other community, is the Sisters of Our Lady of Mercy of Charleston, which was started in Charleston in the late 1820s by the famous Irish bishop, John England, despite the last name. And John England was a great sort of reconciler of the Catholic Church with American society. And he founded this order. They were moved from Columbia in relative safety in the interior of South Carolina to Charleston just before the war by the third bishop of Charleston, Patrick Lynch, unknowingly putting them in harm's way. And you can see here the ruins of the cathedral at Charleston as a result of a great fire that broke out in 1861. In addition to that fire, constant Union shelling for much of the war damaged the sisters' convent. And so they were living in the city, taking care of wounded Union and Confederate prisoners, dying men, sick men, etc., all the while in potential danger themselves. They were especially famous post-war, the immediate post-war period, for that service to the Union soldiers, because again, they got into it to help the Confederate wounded, but soon they found that captured Union soldiers were there and were in even greater need because their needs were being neglected vis-a-vis the Confederate prisoners, right? They're not going to get the best rations. They're not going to get the same amount of food necessarily as the Confederates are. The Confederates are going to take care of their own. So they organized an incredible relief effort to get private citizens of Charleston to take care of these men, some men who were pretty much living out in open conditions in horrible prisons in the Charleston area, sort of like what you see at Andersonville, with pretty much no shelter at all. And so this is one of the testimonies of one of the survivors, Union survivors from the Civil War, Lieutenant Colonel Payne of the 100th New York. He says, "I have met with many of the officers and soldiers who had been in Charleston as prisoners, as he had himself, and they all universally speak of the unbounded kindness and goodness of the Sisters of Mercy of Charleston." This letter was part of a larger effort to get the federal government to compensate the sisters for the damage to their convent, considering all that they had done for federal troops during the war. It was partially successful, actually. They actually did get some money and were able to buy a new convent. And now the temptation here is to think that these stories are all hagiography, that these are all sanitized, overly heroicized stories. And certainly there's some element of that in some parts of the story that he tells. But the thing is, I've done a lot of research on this for my first book, and you look at all the research that we put into this book, the people that they talk about are real people. The people who write testimonials are real people. The stories they tell, even though these communities are not in communication at all, are very similar. They're all telling the same kinds of heroic, self-sacrificing stories, and the sheer number of them, the sheer weight of evidence points to this as, I think, the highlight of the church's participation in the Civil War. But don't just take my word for it. Let's turn to our introduction and look at John Schofield, a Protestant, what he had to say. "From my own observation on the unanimous testimony of all whom I have heard speak on the subject, I regard the conduct of the Catholic sisters associated with the Army during the late war as one of the highest and noblest exemplifications of the Christian religion of which we have any knowledge in our age of the Church." He went on to compare it to the early missionaries going out amongst the barbarians. That's what John Schofield thought. And now let's turn away from Cunningham, and what about some of the other evidence out there? This quote comes from another source, from a corporal from Wisconsin who was recovering in one of the sisters' hospitals in Washington. He said to his sister, "We have for attendants in this hospital several nuns, or sisters of charity as they are called." As I said, everybody's a sister of charity during the Civil War. "They infuse life into the sick room and scatter comfort with a generous hand in many a lowly cottage. However much I differ with them in their religious belief, I cannot but think them honest in their creed." I apologize. The gentleman on the left there is John Schofield, and the lady on the right, this is her quote, a Protestant female nurse who served the Union cause. Quote, If I had ever felt prejudice against these sisters as nurses, my experience with them during the war would have dissipated it entirely, end quote. That's a really, really powerful quote from Mary Livermore, a very famous Protestant reformer from the 19th century. So what's the legacy of these women after the war? There are definitely signs of appreciation for what they did during the conflict. All those testimonials, almost all of them speak to the sisters from the introduction of Cunningham's work. I think we could have just published that introduction and had a pretty darn good article, but it's a wide variety of people, most of them not Catholic. 2 Dominican nuns were chosen for a special honor. In 1874, President Grant, General Sherman, everybody who was anybody was in Springfield, Illinois to celebrate a new monument dedicated to Abraham Lincoln, not this monument, but a different one, dedicated to Abraham Lincoln at his gravesite in Springfield, Illinois. And who had the honor of unveiling this remarkable statue? 2 Dominican nuns who, as one of the women who wrote later, who was involved in this, recalled, it was a seen and told to us to be a token of appreciation by the U.S. government for what we had done during the conflict. If you go to Cleveland, Ohio, just a bit north, I suppose, they have a massive Civil War memorial there. Part of that memorial is dedicated to the women of the North, or women in Cleveland, and one of those women is a nun. Something you wouldn't expect, right, from that culture that produced Maria Monk. In 1924, that statue went up outside of the former cathedral in Washington, D.C. That's Nuns of the Battlefield. They received permission from Congress to put it in that public space, and that depicts a number of the religious communities who served during the Civil War. That was the brainchild and the work of course, many people were involved, but one remarkable woman named Ellen Ryan Jolie, who was the president of the Ladies' Auxiliary of the Ancient Order of the Hibernians, read about these sisters and wanted to do something to commemorate them, and that was the result of her work. Not only did she do that, she also petitioned the government to get special markers placed on all the sisters who had served as nurses during the Civil War, special markers on their gravesites. So if you go and you go to the Sisters of the Holy Cross, for example, you'll see those special markers indicating that they were U.S. Army nurses during the Civil War. To top it all off, in 1927, she wrote a book, The Nuns of the Battlefield, which was, at that point, the most important history, and still in many ways, the most complete history of Catholic sisters during the Civil War. She didn't have direct access to to the women who were still alive like Cunningham did, but she did some incredible work to commemorate their activities. So I know I've gone a little bit long, especially with that story about my favorite Sisters of the Holy Cross. So I just want to say, while we admire David Power Cunningham, which is the greatest portrait taken during the Civil War, in my opinion, the man knows what he's about. We hope that you will read this book, and we hope that you will enjoy the parts of it that we didn't talk about today. We really hope that the publication of this book makes it easier for those non-Catholic historians of the Civil War to start talking about Catholics, and vice versa. We hope that Catholic historians of America will increasingly talk about the Civil War. They have this wonderful resource. Why not use it? They don't even have to go to the archive anymore. And we just want to say thank you so much for being here. Thank you.
Good job. Thank you. Okay, thanks for joining us.
You know, I have digital in my title, but doesn't mean I know how to actually use it.
Okay, now you can hear me. Okay, great. Okay, so we do have an opportunity for a few questions, and there are 2 seminarians who have portable microphones who are happy to bring that microphone in your direction. Let's begin in the back on this side, and then we'll move to the other side.
I was wondering, Father Dave, in your research, obviously we had a local regiment here that was extremely Catholic with the
Right.
10th Ohio, and a chaplain and a military commander in a unit have a very special bond. And I was wondering if in your research you found anything between then Colonel Lytle and Chaplain O'Higgins.
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, one of the things, and Father O'Higgins is mentioned briefly in Soldiers of the Cross, I think 3 brief mentions. But one of the things that I've been able to share with a couple different groups at a couple different parishes is the amazing story of Father O'Higgins, who was a Cincinnati priest, one of 2 Cincinnati priests that were chaplains. And his connection with the Ohio 10th, which is the Irish Catholic regiment that's raised here in Cincinnati, is really pretty remarkable. So I would say that you can see a sense of admiration for many of the chaplains that are contained in Cunningham's Soldiers of the Cross, but I don't know of anyone who is lauded more by their own men, by the soldiers themselves, than by what we see with Father O'Higgins. So we see this in diaries that exist. We see this in newspaper articles that were submitted at times even by the soldiers themselves or those that were involved in camp life, who were involved with the regiment. So yeah, I think we don't want to lose track of the fact that here in Cincinnati we have a couple great examples. Obviously on the side of the Sisters of Charity of Cincinnati, but in terms of the chaplains, Father E.P. Corcoran, who's with the 60th Ohio, I believe, and then Father O'Higgins with the 10th Ohio. So good question. Yeah. Over here.
Yes. So my name is Janet Ray. I'm a convert to the Catholic Church because of Elizabeth Ann Seton. I was Anglican, and because of John Henry Newman, who's going to be canonized in October. I teach at the Mount, and it makes me crazy. Why did you not invite Judith Metz, the historian at the Mount, to be part of this conversation? I don't understand that.
Well, yeah, I've worked with Sister.
No, I'm not finished yet.
Oh, okay.
I'm not finished yet.
Oh boy. Okay.
These were the nurses. I'm a nurse. We were the people at Emmitsburg, at Gettysburg. We were the people in Kentucky and Ohio. We were the ones there. And you don't have any of those people talking to you? I don't understand that. And then you have the nerve to talk about other people than the Sisters of Charity. They were the biggest presence here. I don't understand that.
Okay, so I've worked with Sister Judy on a number of projects, and I think this is a book launch related to Cunningham's book. So there's lots of other stories that can be told, but
No,
yeah.
But this is here. We're here in Cincinnati.
Right, yeah. Okay. Okay. Thanks. Thanks.
How far is Emmitsburg from Gettysburg? It's not that far, is it?
No, it's not. It's just down the road. It's only 20 miles, something like that.
Because I was taught by the Daughters of Charity. We heard the stories.
Right.
How the sisters went to Gettysburg.
They did.
And there's both sides.
Yes.
And also, you talked about how some of the Holy Cross sisters went to Illinois and Kentucky. Did they generally stay in one location, or did they, like some of the priests, like Father Edgar said, travel with the soldiers from place to place?
They, as Mother Angela saw fit to send them around, they did occasionally trade places and move around as a sister would gain experience, and newer sisters would take religious vows. They would be sent to a new place to start a new hospital, that sort of thing. And then a number of the sisters honestly burned out and had to come back to South Bend. Same thing with a lot of the priests all over the country as well. So they mostly stayed in one or two places, yeah, during the war. That's right.
Thank you for your talk. I thought it was great. Was curious. I'm sure you're aware of, and I'm blanking on her name. I'm so embarrassed. She's the president of Harvard, Gillen. You know who I'm talking about. She wrote this.
Drew Gilpin Faust.
Yes, she wrote This Republic of Suffering. Did you come across anything at all about how important the role of the nuns or the priests were? Because that whole period, the mourning and death, and how hard that was, where people didn't even know where their soldiers, where their family members were, and they had to go out in the battlefields looking for them. Did you come across anything like that in the role of the nuns or priests? Thank you.
Yes, if you look at the chapter on the Sisters of Mercy of Charleston, there actually are a couple letters written to them where the wives or the fiancés really want to know, did my did my husband die a good death? Did he die in a state of grace? I mean, this is a very important question for a lot of family members. So the fact that the sisters were there and were getting priests or the Methodist minister, they were very attentive to getting a soldier, regardless of their denomination, some spiritual care at the end of their lives. And in some cases, providing that themselves. When there was no priest available, they would literally baptize someone, right? And so they were playing an important role in that person's salvation, right? According to Catholic theology, they were stepping in. A number of the stories you get in this book are about men from denominations that didn't believe that baptism was necessary for salvation, and so that was always a point of emphasis for the sisters, that they get the men baptized. If they became Catholic, that they of course wanted that, but they really wanted to make sure that men who hadn't been baptized got it. Speaking to the larger issue that book raises, I don't think that the Civil War was a crisis of faith for Catholics like it was for Protestants, given just very briefly the nature of Protestant theology at that time made it more susceptible to being questioned as a result of the horrific suffering of the Civil War. Whereas Catholics, remember, many of these are Irishmen, and the potato famine, the number of people who died in the potato famine or were displaced is much greater than the percentage of casualties during the Civil War. So they've already gone through this horrific event, and the Civil War is, unfortunately for many of them, the second go-around in their lives.
Father, I just wanted to ask, where did you first learn about this manuscript at Notre Dame?
That's a great question, and I don't know that I entirely remember the very first time that I ever saw the name Cunningham Soldiers of the Cross, but I can tell you that when I was in my final year of undergraduate at Xavier University, I did a seminar paper on Archbishop Purcell's approach to the question of slavery. And I had a chance to go to the archives of the Archdiocese, which at the time actually was in the lower level of the seminary building. And I ran across a number of letters that were from this Father William T. O'Higgins. And that started me in the direction of researching Catholic chaplains, especially Father O'Higgins, and that led me eventually to this Soldiers of the Cross. So I believe it was, we were trying to actually kind of retrace our steps a little bit a few days ago. It was either in 2012 or 2013 that we kind of began this collaboration. So it was a long time in coming. As you can imagine, to get to a 500-page printed book that's based in a manuscript, think about how many manuscript pages had to be transcribed, annotated, kind of gone back and forth. So it off and on it took us about 6 years. But the funny thing is that I kind of remember we were in a meeting of the American Catholic Historical Association, and I think Dr. Kurtz said to me, are you familiar with this manuscript? And I said, yeah, I was just thinking it should be published someday. And we both reflect now on the fact that we thought that would have been a much easier process than it was. I don't think we thought we would be here in 2019 with this book. And I would say back in probably 2016 and 17, I wondered whether this would ever be published by anyone, let alone us. But we're happy that we made it this far. So, but thank you. That's a great question. Yeah, let's go to the back here if we have the I'm making Patrick run around here today.
Good exercise.
I'll take it. And I want to thank you both for a wonderful book.
Thank you.
What a great read. And starting with the cover, I've got 2 plugs and a question. So the plug is for this painting on the cover of your book by Paul Wood that you can go see in the Steidt Museum at Notre Dame, right? And the cover doesn't do it justice because it's a wonderful painting. And he died when he was 19 in a very bizarre accident, but the painting is a true work of art, and you can comment on that in a minute. The chapter that Cunningham has on Father Corby is unfortunately short, and your note at the beginning of the chapter is to read Corby's memoirs, which is a fascinating read. It's humorous. He corresponded with President Lincoln, pleading for clemency, so you can comment on that. And then Father Peter Whalen, Cunningham did not cover him, but the Angel of Andersonville, right? Who was a chaplain to both Confederate and Union troops, an unbelievable human being who suffered with troops, right there with them. So things you can maybe pick on and take off on. So thank you for the book.
So before I forget, my first book, even though it has a grandiose title about Catholic America, is focused on the North. So I've actually had people walk up to me and refuse to buy it when they found out there were no Confederates. Eventually I got so upset that I told them I don't write about traitors, and then they got really mad at me. It's very easy to trigger some people, apparently. But Paul Wood, from my understanding, was he actually apprenticed under the Italian master who came to Notre Dame to do those beautiful paintings inside the Basilica of the Sacred Heart. And so he trained with the best. He sort of romanticized that image. There's I think 1990 depiction of the same event, which shows Corby on the actual 1-foot tall rock as opposed to the 10-foot tall boulder that the event happened on. But it's all about portraying that heroic image, that reminding everyone that the church was involved in the most important battle of the Civil War, and the church played a positive role at that battle, and the sons of the church bled and died for the country to save the Union. So that's what that painting is about. It has a definite message, and Paul Wood did a brilliant job with it as well. Let's see here, and I'm missing what the middle thing was. Corby. Yeah, so Corby's memoirs are fantastic. The really interesting thing about Corby's memoirs is that he did it pretty much from memory. There's only one letter I've ever found of his from the Civil War. I've found letters to him, but not from him. Just one letter, which is very short and doesn't really shed much light on his role as a chaplain. And it's a phenomenal work published in the early 1890s as he was starting to get involved in Civil War commemoration. Corby is one of the people who is pushing for Catholics to join Protestants in the GAR, that GAR picture that was shown, the Grand Army of the Republic, to celebrate both Catholic and Protestant patriotism on behalf of the Union during the Civil War. He is a remarkable priest who serves for several years. Although the thing I always like to tell people is that he's not the first one to absolve his troops on a battlefield, but he was smart enough to do it at the Gettysburg, which is the most important battle and the only one that matters for many people remembering the Civil War, even though it wasn't the real turning point. I'm sorry. Whoops. Let's throw that hand grenade out there. But he becomes very famous for that, and he was absolutely devoted to his men, and they were devoted to him as well. And you see that in the letters of another book I'll recommend, the collected letters of Peter Welsh, who was an Irish color sergeant in the 28th Massachusetts, one of those units in the famous Irish Brigade, one of 5 regiments. And people don't realize this. The problem with Paul Wood's painting is that there's probably twice as many men who are actually in the Irish Brigade at that point, depicted in that painting. A brigade that should have had ideally 4,000 to 5,000 men had only 500 left when they got to Gettysburg. It's not even a regiment, okay? And if you look at the letters of Peter Welsh, you see him refer to Corby again and again. He is the priest that's, of all the priests, that stands out in the Irish Brigade. And he's the one who celebrates the Mass. Him and Father Willett, who's also in this book, they celebrate the Mass at the dedication of the Irish Brigade Memorial at Gettysburg in 1888. So absolutely an essential part of that unit's Catholic identity and Catholic practice.
Let's do one final question. Brother, your side.
Thank you. I was very much inspired by your talk this evening as well. There is a rather well-known Redemptorist priest by the name of Blessed Francis Xavier Seelos, who is well known for his priestly ministry in New Orleans. And if I'm not mistaken, there were a couple of years where he actually spent time at Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland, as a formation director for seminarians there. And I think I came across an episode in his experience at Mount St. Mary's where he was so concerned about seminarians that were being pulled from their seminary studies to serve compulsory military service during the Civil War that he petitioned President Lincoln to exempt seminarians from that compulsory military service. Are you aware that Blessed Francis Seelos did have this personal meeting with President Lincoln to petition this exemption for seminarians?
That's something you know about. I don't.
There's actually a book of his letters that were published as part of the process for his canonization, which I'm not sure where it is right now. I don't think it's advanced as far as people would like it to. I don't know about the personal meeting. I do know that he definitely petitioned Lincoln. The problem for one of the reasons why a lot of Catholics were not on board with the Union war effort is because the Union refused to exempt clergy, both so priests, seminarians, or brothers from service in the draft, and a number of them actually did have to go and fight in the Union Army. Brothers did, and so each individual order or community had to petition Lincoln directly to get this exemption. Some of them were more successful than others. And so Seelos did it on behalf of his community. Boniface Wimmer, who was I think a Benedictine monk in the middle of nowhere, Pennsylvania, Latrobe, sorry if there's anybody from Latrobe, had to do it, and he wrote this great letter where he's like, these guys I don't think they can carry a musket, so what do you want them for? Basically, they're just not meant for it. And then I'm sorry, I just know the story better. What the Holy Cross community did was they had the good fortune to have Ellen Sherman, the wife of General Sherman, living in South Bend, so they got her to support their petition in addition to General Grant and General Sherman to get exemption. Unfortunately, what happened during this, the payback for that was that the community was going to vote Republican in 1864. That message never got dispersed, so every one of them voted for the Democrats. So the local Indiana congressman, Schuyler Colfax, out of retribution, got rid of their exemption, and so they had to, beg Ellen Sherman to get it reinstated, which she did indeed get it done. So this was definitely a point of contention. Not only the draft for those poor Irish workers who didn't want to serve, but also the draft of clergymen. It was really despised.
Well, thanks everybody for joining us this evening. I do want to ask our bookstore manager the status of books. Okay. And I can add in the copy, my extra copy as well. So there are 3 copies left if anybody is interested in procuring it tonight. Dr. Kurtz and I will be very happy to answer any other questions or to sign copies of books or anything else. So thanks, have a great evening.